afternoon, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation so far. Today, I will be speaking about the cognitive effects of natural and artificial light on memory recollection. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Holbrook, and I am a senior at Galileo Magnet High School in Danville, Virginia. In the fall, I will be attending the University of Virginia to major in political science and communications. You might be asking yourself why I chose this topic for my research, so I'd like to paint a picture for you. At the beginning of this school year, I began taking a biology class here at Piedmont Governor School. I quickly noticed that I was more alert and attentive during this class, and I questioned why this might be. I went through all the factors before I determined one factor that presented itself very clearly. This classroom had windows, while none of my other classrooms did. This made me wonder if natural lighting was actually causing me to feel more alert and attentive during class, so I decided to put it to the test in my research. This research has a few key real-life applications, those being that should natural light be found to be beneficial to memory recollection, more sunlight-accessible classrooms could be built in the future to help retain high cognitive function within the classroom. In terms of education, the environment in which students are exposed to can have a substantial impact on their success within a class. This psychological environment can be impacted by many factors, including the student's mental and physical health. Malik and Rizvi found that qualities of involvement, personal relevance, and emphasis on understanding have a positive significance on academic achievement. With students spending a majority, if not all of their learning time indoors, lighting is undoubtedly an integral part of a student's learning environment. Despite this, there is conflicting evidence regarding the effects of LED lighting compared to fluorescent lighting. Morrow and Kanakri found that there is not an evident or strong correlation between LED lighting and fluorescent lighting regarding perceived student attitudes and behaviors, while Pillay and Williamson found that LED lights create a more engaged learning environment in early childhood education when compared to fluorescent lights. It is also important to recognize that LED and fluorescent lights are very modern inventions when compared to the development of the human brain, making it crucial that we ask the question of how natural light compares to the artificial. Jacoby Vessels found in her review of the literature that nature plays an extremely important role in early childhood development and education. This brings up the question of why we don't value nature and outdoor time in adolescent education in the same way that it is valued for younger children. Now, to understand how lighting types can affect memory, it's also important to understand how cognitive function as a whole is impacted by environmental factors. As found by Cortese and Khanna, many variables, such as valence and emotional context, are impactful towards memory. Since our emotions are tied to our experience as human beings, it is natural that they would also impact our memory. Kanazawa et al. Found that sunlight exposure in particular is responsible for increasing happiness due to instinctual psychological responses. Another factor in cognitive function is serotonin, widely known as a neurotransmitter that affects emotions and how the human body reacts to outside stimuli. Lambert et al. Found that increased levels of sunlight lead to an increase in serotonin turnover rates in the brain. These levels of sunlight are impacted by the season, offering a possible explanation for seasonal depression and other emotional fluctuations. Another factor that is known to impact cognitive function is vitamin D, which is associated with emotional regulation and physical health. Sunlight exposure in particular leads to greater levels of vitamin D within the body, which is supported by a study done by Fields et al. Zhang and Xu found that vitamin D levels are positively correlated with cognitive function. Adults with physical frailty were also found to have lower levels of vitamin D than those without physical frailty. This suggests that sunlight not only has a mental impact, but also a physical one. After conducting my review of the literature, it was apparent that there existed a gap in the research on how sunlight affects cognitive function. Specifically, I was unable to find any studies that focused on the comparison between natural and artificial light, which led me to develop my research question. What effect does artificial and natural light have on memory recollection. Next, I curated my hypotheses for which my experiment would be based upon. My research hypothesis was, if a group of participants are given a memory recollection test under varying lighting conditions, then the group exposed to natural sunlight will score the highest. My null hypothesis stated that alternatively, there would be no difference in test scores amongst the groups. Before I could begin conducting my experiment, I first had to map out exactly what variables I would be testing for and controlling. For my experiment, my independent variable was the lighting type in which a person was exposed to, and the dependent variable was the test scores from a memory recollection test. My control group was the fluorescent lighting group, as that is what is commonly used in school buildings. I administered the same test to each participant, making it my constant. I will further go into why I had a small number of constants later on during the limitations portion of my presentation. When actually conducting my experiment, my first step was to obtain consent from all of my participants, as well as the teachers whose rooms I would be using for the experiment. Next, I gathered all the materials I needed, which included LED and fluorescent lights, testing materials, and participants. My sample size was 30, with a sample population of high school students aged 15 to 18. From here, I was able to begin administering my test to my participants. I first randomly grouped the participants into 3 experimental groups based on the type of light that they would be receiving. I then tested each participant one by one in an enclosed environment to avoid possible distractions. The test consisted of first giving the participant a list of 30 words and allowing them to study the list for 1.5 minutes. Next, the participants were asked to complete a maze to act as an interference period, preventing participants to use a memorization tactic. Following this period, a list of 40 words featuring 20 of the previously listed words and 20 completely new words was given to the participants. They were then asked to mark each word that they had remembered seeing from the first list of words. After completing this test, scores were then calculated and compiled as raw data. On the screen now, you'll see examples of the testing conditions of the 3 experimental groups. In order from left to right, these pictures show first the LED lighting group, second the fluorescent lighting group, and thirdly the natural light group. I'd also like to point out that despite the LED lighting group appearing very dark in comparison to the other environments, this is simply because I was limited in my access to changing the overhead lights of the room and thus resulted in using smaller portable lights to create the environment. Lux levels were tested to ensure that the level of light between the groups was within a reasonable range of difference. To begin analyzing my data, I used a one-way ANOVA test to compare the mean memory recollection test scores amongst the experimental groups. After completing this statistical test, I concluded that at the significance level of 0.05, the null hypothesis was not rejected with a p-value of 0.84. While my data did not show a significant statistical difference between the groups, some data and conclusion can still be considered from my research. On the graph shown on screen, the data collected from my 3 experimental groups is shown. This illustrates the overall range of scores from my 3 experimental groups. Particularly interesting is the third box plot, shown in green all the way to the right. Here you can see that compared to the other box plots, this group had a much wider range of scores, suggesting that further research is needed to fully conclude its significance. To conclude my results, there is not sufficient evidence at the 0.05 significance level to conclude that memory tests taken in exposure to sunlight have increased scores compared to the artificial light. My study had a number of limitations, with a majority of them relating to an overall lack of controls. The most major limitation I was able to identify was my inability to control the environment in which the participants were tested in. To use photos from earlier on in my presentation, you can see that each experimental group was tested in a separate environment. This was due to the availability of space on the particular day that I was experimenting. To expand upon this, I believe that taking a test in a principal's office would elicit a much different psychological response when compared to taking a test in a hallway. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I had a lack of access in changing overhead lights, which I believe would greatly impact the results of future experiments. Another glaring limitation in my experiment was a lack of participants. At the end of the day, it's difficult to get high school students to participate in an experiment that takes up time that they could be spending completing homework or participating in class activities. I believe that in future experiments, many limitations could be minimized with minimal difficulty, given proper access to equipment. By changing the lighting type over a larger period of time, such as an entire semester, and using overall class grades or a final exam as an independent variable, I believe that different results would be yielded. Since students would not have to change any part of their typical school routine, I believe that this would also increase participation as well as reliability of results. The process of completing this project has given me an extremely personal experience with the research process, which I will undoubtedly use throughout my further education and career. Despite not planning to go into a STEM field, I know that the skills I was taught and used throughout my experiment will serve as the building blocks to continue learning and growing into a well-rounded individual who will contribute not only to the political sphere, but also to the scientific one. I would like to thank all of my governor's school teachers for offering me a positive and challenging learning environment where I was able to learn and grow not only academically, but also as a person. Specifically, I would like to thank Ms. Long, who was an immense help in planning my experiment, as well as writing the paper portion of my project. I would also like to thank my Galileo biology teacher, Mr. Carter, for keeping me sane during my senior year and helping me with the experimentation process. Thank you. Are there any questions at this time? All right, Ms. Probst.
And just to clarify, I might have missed it. So when the students or participants were learning the words or memorizing the words, where were they?
So the question was, where were the students as they were learning the words? So each of the participants were tested in different environments, but they all learned the words in the same environment that they ended up taking the test in.
That's what I wanted to make sure. So they learned in the same lighting.
Yes.
When you tested in the different lightings. Okay.
Ms. Davis?
I don't know how to ask this. Did each of your groups test in each kind of light?
So Ms. Davis asked if each of my groups tested in the same, like each of them tested in each group of light. So no, they didn't. It was randomized, and so 10 would go to one group, and then 10 would go to another group, and then 10 to the other.